Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar, where we continue to feature the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums moving into the summer season. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land and give an offering of respect. Tonight, we are celebrating a truly stellar debut novel published by our friends over at Melville House in Brooklyn. Nandita Dinesh celebrates her new novel, This Place, That Place. Now, one of the great pleasures of this job is being able to host new works by authors that excite us. Nandita Dinesh is precisely this kind of writer whose work just speaks to us on so many different levels. We are delighted to be able to feature her and to bring light to this significant new work. Nandita Dinesh holds a PhD in drama from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and an MA in performance studies from the Tisch School of the Arts in New York University. Her work has explored the role that theater and writing can play during and after violent conflict. Ms. Dinesh has conducted community-based theater projects in Kashmir, in India, Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Rwanda, and elsewhere around the world. She has written multiple books about her work, and in 2017, she was awarded the Elliott Hayes Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dramaturgy by Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. This Place, That Place is her first novel. We are so honored, really, to be able to feature it tonight. Joining her in conversation this evening is the award-winning novelist, Shobha Rao, who is, of course, no stranger to City Lights. We've been happily hosting her for years now for her awesome writing. Shobha's published work include An Unrestored Woman and Girls Burn Brighter. She won the 2014 Catherine Ann Porter Prize, is a recipient of the Elizabeth George Foundation Fellowship, and has been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories of 2015. She has a new work in the making. I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it just yet, but we're really excited about that. So we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of This Place, That Place. Also going to be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the discussion. So please post your questions, your comments, your praise in that same chat function. May I also suggest that you switch your viewing settings to speaker view to enhance your viewing experience. That can be accomplished by going up to the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom dashboard in the prompt. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Nandita Dinesh and Shobha Rao. Welcome to you both, and welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Nandita, I was thinking that we would start with a reading.
Let's do that.
Yeah, and I'm super excited because you have included me in this reading. So if you'd like to start, we can either start with the reading or we can start with maybe a synopsis of the novel to give the reading some context. It's totally up to you.
So why don't you start with a synopsis, Shobha, and then I can just contextualize the reading a little bit before we dive in.
Okay, so if I may, This Place, That Place is an extraordinary novel. It's set in an unnamed country called This Place, and it is a place that's occupied by a country called That Place. And the entire novel takes place during a time of curfew. And really, it's the story of two of your main characters, the protagonists, a female from this place. So he is part of the occupied region, and then a visiting female friend from that place. So she's part of the occupying nation. So it's really an incredible exploration of the tensions and the sort of challenges of being an occupied place and part of the occupying place. So and we'll obviously get so much deeper into that discussion, but I'll let you then now talk more about the reading.
Thank you, Shobha. And everyone, Peter asked me to show you what the book looks like. So here is the requested pose with the book. The extract that Shobha and I are going to read is from somewhere close to the early parts of the novel. It's one of the conversations that takes place between the two protagonists. As Shobha rightly mentioned, he is from this place, the occupied region, and she's from that place, the occupying nation state. And they have these conversations, but because they have such a deep fondness for each other, he tries to refrain most often from using the word occupation when they talk, because he's worried that using that word is going to alienate his friend. In this particular extract that we read, they've just had a conversation where he hasn't been able to help himself and he's used the O word. And that's where this conversation begins.
And it begins with him speaking, the male.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So I'm reading for him and Shobha is reading for her. I know you're not them.
I'm not them.
No, you're just, you know.
I'm just from there,
Yeah.
from the land of the occupiers.
I should have.
It's fine. I told you, it's fine. I'm fine. We're fine. We don't have to talk about this anymore.
I can see that I've upset you.
No, it's not you. It's just this, all of this. You're right. It is an occupation. And I'm from that place of occupiers. I don't know how to sit with that knowledge.
Being from the land of occupiers and being one yourself, two different things.
But it's a fine line, isn't it? Is the occupier only the government that allows this to happen? And the person who's on the streets holding the gun to carry out that government's orders? Or is it also the person from that place who knows what is happening and doesn't do anything about it? Is it also the person from that place who does something, knowing that it won't be enough to dismantle the occupation? Is it also the person from that place who chooses not to know what is being done in their name? Is it also the person who continues to pay taxes even after knowing what is being done in their name? And what about the person who turns a blind eye to what's happening because they can't be bothered? Or because they are so consumed by their own daily occupations that they cannot see past the murk? Or
Stop, please.
I'm not as upset as listing those things made me sound.
Who said anything about being upset?
You asked me to stop.
Not because, look, I asked you to stop because that list could go on forever. And I see the point you're trying to make. The categories are complex, but the category of occupier, it doesn't apply to all those people. It applies to the government, to the people who enact the government's word, to the people who ask the government to continue that work in this place, but it doesn't apply to those who are like
complicit.
Well, there are different layers to complicity and different degrees of, you know.
There are degrees of separation, yes, but the center of the circle, that's the same. It's the occupation. Wherever you lie, it's in relation to that center. So ergo, somehow, when you call this an occupation, am I not one of the occupiers?
Okay, so let's say for argument's sake, only for the sake of argument, that I agree with your logic. I'm not saying that I do, but for argument's sake, let's say that I do. How does that help anything? How does making you part of a catch-all category help any of us?
It helps just like other labels and categories do. It helps create a situational framework where we are all clear about where we stand.
Okay, and in this moment, in this situation, where two people from this place and that place are waiting for a wedding to get back on track, how does that situational framework help?
It helps remind me that we, as this, I don't know.
They sat in more silence, like they always did when the outside came in, when their camaraderie and friendship with undercurrents and their conversations and their interactions were invaded by the reality of the occupation. When they were forced to come to terms with being from opposing sides of a war. When they were forced to recognize the imbalances of power that came from nationhood and subjecthood. When the two of them had to reckon with the reality of what it would mean to explore their undercurrents as they found themselves wanting to more and more every day. When words like occupation emerged, they had to really look at the chasms that separated them and consider the possibility that nothing, no effort, no conversation, no attempt, no goal of understanding, nothing might ever be enough to bring them together in the way that they wanted to be brought together. In the way that if they were being really honest with themselves, they fantasized about being together. When words like occupation were not mentioned, they could lull themselves into a false sense of security, a sense of hope, a sense that maybe another world was possible, that maybe if more people from this place and that place really tried to talk to each other, if more people from this place and that place really tried to understand each other, the occupation would dissipate into insignificance. When words like occupation went unmentioned, they could convince themselves that it didn't matter that they came from opposing sides. They could allow the lack of naming to create the illusion of a relationship between equal peers. They could do all this until words like occupation emerged in conversation, intentionally, flippantly, in whatever way. When words like occupation emerge in conversation, reality always hits home. The reality that whatever the undercurrents between them, whatever connection they shared, whatever attempt they made to understand, whatever hope they had for their micro status quo as symbolizing vis-a-vis a macro shift, when words like occupation emerged in conversation, they were reminded that nothing could change until the occupation ended. Nothing between them could change until the occupation ended. Talk about impossible stakes.
Thank you for that beautiful reading, Nandita. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me, Shobha.
Of course, it was my pleasure. And it's my pleasure to be here with you to talk about this incredible novel. So let's actually just start by talking about occupation. Okay. So what I so admired about your novel is the way in which you explored the many layers of this occupation and of life through this lens of occupation. And so, and not just between the regions and the nation states, right? But also through the delayed wedding, for instance. And then also through the granularity of this frustrated desire and individual longing between these two characters. So could you talk about the many layers of occupation and the tensions that you explored?
Absolutely. So let's start with the most obvious one, right? So there's the occupation that's a military occupation where that place is occupying this place. So there is that sense of occupation hanging in the air, as it were, between everyone who inhabits the world of this book. And then there are the ways in which, and that's what I was really keen to explore, is the way the occupation seeps into everyday life. Right. So from everything from a wedding, which you usually associate with being these moments of joy and celebration and coming together, and just asking, what does a wedding look like under an occupation? Surely people still get married, but what does that look like? And then you go even into the more intimate layers, right? What does occupation feel like in a friendship? What does occupation feel like between parent and child? What does occupation feel like between siblings? So there's that layer to the exploration in the book. And then I would say that the additional sort of even more intimate layer for these two characters is, how do we occupy ourselves? So how do these larger narratives that shape us, even without the presence of a nation state, telling us that we are occupied? What are the ways in which we enact these bizarre norms and conditions that just function to restrict us in these different ways, right? So there's this, I would say, almost these concentric circles of occupation, from the political to the interpersonal to the deeply, deeply personal and individual.
Oh my gosh, I just got goosebumps when you said, how do we occupy ourselves? That question alone will haunt me for years to come. So, but also, in terms of how you explore that topic of occupation, what I wanted to ask you about is the conundrum of the outsider, right? Mm-hmm. So the female character is coming from that place into this place. So she's an outsider, and and that just takes on an added weight in a conflict zone, right? Being the outsider. So what I wanted to ask you is how you would characterize this conundrum of being the outsider, and how it really became to be the central force in your novel, this idea of the outsider.
Absolutely. So what happens in sort of general terms, without giving away too much of what happens in the book, is when this woman comes in from that place, she comes in with a lot of ideals, right? So she comes in thinking, hey,
Yes.
if I go there with all of these good intentions and show these folks that I'm actually on their side and maybe there's something that's possible. And over the years, she's been working in this place now for almost a decade. Her friendship with this man is becoming close to romantic. And she is at the place in her relationship, both with the territory and with this person, that you would think makes her feel closer to being an insider. And the central dilemma for her is that that never seems to happen. And the thing that keeps, I think, haunting this character in the book is the fact that however much she tries, however well-intentioned she is not from this place. And that's always going to be true. And so the question that she sort of grapples is, then what do I do? If I can never be part of this, if I can never really help, what do I do? Right? So that's sort of the context of her existential angst, if you will. And I think that particular character for me resonates on multiple personal levels, right? So a lot of my own work since 2005 has been asking about the role of art, particularly theater and writing, in times of conflict and in post-conflict zones. And as an added layer to that work, having to ask myself, what is my role in this as someone who's outside? And it went from being very kumbaya to thinking that I could go in with my theater work and solve, every divide in the world, to realizing that maybe I needed to navigate that outsiderness more carefully and go to places where I was not too much of an outsider, but little more insider than outsider, to realizing that maybe I can never be close to insider. And then what does it mean? So for me, I think her character and that particular dilemma that she faces was very personal in many ways, and drew a lot from my own field work in theater.
Yeah, you can as you're reading, you can tell that she's struggling with this idea, right, of being, sort of a representative of the occupying place, and it's you can feel it on the page as she's sort of, in conversation with the various people in the novel and in her times of aloneness. Yeah. So I can, when you say it's very personal, I felt that personal element. So, and I'm so glad that you brought up art, because my next question actually speaks to that, because you have worked in many conflict zones and in post-conflict zones, as you say. And what I wanted to say is, well, especially with regards to the professions of the two main characters. So the male character is protest designer, and the female is the character is a deprogrammer. So, specifically in the context of military and armies. And so these are both made up professions, and but so interesting. And so what I wanted to, and they're both creative, right? Creative in their own way. So what I wanted to ask you is what you think is the role of art in conflict zones, and specifically, do you think art can or is a form of fighting?
Such a good question, and I wish I had a nice answer to wrap up with a bow and give you, but I don't. The answer's messy. I think there is a purpose, yes, and in my own work, I think the misconception I had was that when you go in with an artistic practice, with a process, and you create like a theatrical production, the misconception I had is that product could change something, right? So you take a play, you go to a group of people, and did I lose you?
I can still hear you.
Oh, sorry. I thought my internet was. And so I had this idea that you go in with this piece, and the piece itself transforms the conversation, right? And leads to something like quote unquote peace. I think what I've realized over the years is that maybe that's not the purpose. The spaces in which I have found art to be most transformative is actually the process and not the product. And so the type of theater work that I've done, it's something called devised theater, where we create theater with a group of collaborators. We don't work from an existing script, and we come up with a script together. And so in that process, what happens is that there are deep bonds that are formed between you as the outsider, theater maker, artist, and the folks who are inside to that particular place. So the most potential I found was in those processes, in the rehearsal room, in reworking scenes and getting into these fiery debates about, but actually, if we say it this way and instead of that way, what are we changing about the narrative? And do we want to change the narrative in that way, you know? So I think that's been the hugest shift for me, is realizing that the potential of art in these contexts of conflict is not necessarily in fighting back overtly and fighting back in terms of the performance itself, but it's in the forms of protest that happen inside people. So I'm thinking of someone in Rwanda I worked with, and we were creating a play during commemoration period, which happens in April, which is the commemoration of the genocide in 1994. And she told me at the end of our device theater workshop, you know, this is the first time since the genocide that I've not been sad in April. And it was fleeting. It was a momentary transformation, but it just felt like, oh, damn, okay, so maybe this is why we're doing the work. And it's not about the play itself, it's about these moments that happen in the rehearsal room. So I think, do I think it's a mode of fighting back? Sort of, insofar as we fight back in the choices that we make in our personal lives against systems that happen beyond our control. But is it the kind of fight that actually transforms those systems? I don't know, right?
Right.
It's a much more individual process.
Sure. And the happiness itself is a kind of victory, you know, so individual happiness, even if it's not a sort of national celebration, and regardless of how fleeting it is. So I really, now that you're talking about productions and plays, could you tell us briefly about that 24-hour?
Oh, absolutely.
That's so intriguing when we spoke about it.
That's perhaps the project that's dearest to my heart. It started as my PhD project sometime in 2013, where my focus was on the possible use of theater in Kashmir. So what can theater do in the conflict zone of Kashmir to engage with the various complexities of the wars there? And my main premise there, Shobha, was to look at the gray zones of the conflict, right? So I was less interested in, well, who is the one perpetrator I can point out, or who is the one victim? It was more sort of saying, okay, what are the gray zones of this conflict that even as someone who's from the subcontinent, I just don't know. Over the course of almost a decade, I was lucky enough to meet a lovely theater company in Srinagar, Ekta, and we collaborated on the creation of a 24-hour immersive theatrical experience. And what that looks like is, from a practical level, is that, so say you, Shobha, you're coming to experience this work. You would join us, say, on 6 p.m. on day 1, and you wouldn't leave as an audience member till 6 p.m. on day 2. Right? So you live with us for a day within the theatrical framework that we've created to host you. And during that day, we sort of share with you different aspects to life in Kashmir. So, you know, one scene might happen in a more conventional theater space, and then you walk as the audience member who's on this tour of Kashmir. You take into another space, which might actually happen in a kitchen, like a real kitchen, where as part of the scene, you're served like chai and biscuits, right? So that you get some energy for the next part of your journey, which might be a scene that happens in a toilet. And so there's this promenade quality to the work. And so it was this 24-hour experience that was primarily targeting outsiders. So anyone who considered themselves an outsider to the conflicts in Kashmir, and who wanted to gain a more embodied understanding of what is happening there.
Incredible. I'm hesitant to say I would definitely go to such a play, because it sounds overwhelming, but of course, why not? You know, why not? Experience art in that sort of, in the, you know, a suspended, sustained way. So yeah, incredible work. So I hope you get to do that again in this world as it is.
Yeah.
So, okay, this question is for me, and I hesitate to ask it because I'm asking you basically to make really gross generalizations. I'm so curious, what have you found? I mean, you've been in many conflict and post-conflict zones, so in various countries in Africa and Latin America or Central America and so on. So, and Kashmir, of course. So what have you found that to be common amongst conflict zones, and what are not so common? If I could ask for such gross generalizations, but if you could speak to that.
That's a tough one, right? Because the one thing that is common is that nothing is common. So there is the fact that, every conflict zone is so highly contextual.
Sure.
With their particular histories, their particular culture, the particular conflict itself, who are the different sides participating in the conflict. And I think for me, if that's one takeaway, is that none of them feel the same. No two of them feel the same, right? Every specific context I've been in has felt very different. I think the kind of generalizations that I could make are more on the steps that I've had to take as an outsider, that I think there are some parallels that have been similar across contexts, right? So one thing really being hyper vigilant about how I use language. So not using categories for people without really understanding what those terms, how they're loaded in that context. So a simple word, like rebel, right? In one context, so in Guatemala, when I used that word, there was generally a very positive connotation. There's like, oh, guerrillero, someone who's a rebel and who's fighting for a cause. I use that same word in Kashmir, and the connotation is very different, and it was even different based on who you're speaking to. So one person would see a rebel in that sort of romantic sense, and someone else would see it as a quote unquote terrorist, right? And so I think one of the commonalities that I've seen in how I approach my work is just being very, very careful about how I use language, especially when it comes to talking about groups of people, that it's really, really, it could be incendiary.
And very fraught. And that reminds me of the saying, very similar to what you're saying, which is, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, so yeah, I can understand. And that maybe is when the power of language really hits home. And because when we're writing, of course, we understand the power of language, but that is the power of language in the world and in a world with weapons. So
exactly, right? Because you're in that situation, it's not a question of, I remember this colleague, if I could share an anecdote for a second, we were creating this play in Kashmir in which we happened to call a certain group of people, and I'll be deliberately vague, we were calling them a perpetrator in a particular context. And then one of the actors came to me at the end of rehearsal and he said, I really don't think we should be doing that. And I think you need to change the language. And I said, but it's a play, so it's fine. You're playing a character. Your character is calling that group of, or that person a perpetrator. You're not doing it. And he looked at me and he said, Nandita, you think if the guys with guns show up at my door, they're going to wait for me to explain to them that I was actually playing a character who used that word? They're not going to wait. They're going to think it's me. We need to change that word. And I remember, and this is after I'd been working in conflict zones for a long time, and I thought I understood some of the sensitivities, and I think that comment just blew me away.
Yeah.
That even, that layer of, you go from a post-conflict zone to an active conflict zone, and there's another shift in intensity,
Wow, right, of course. I mean, things that we don't, many of us have the privilege to not have to think about, so wow, incredible. Thank you for sharing that anecdote. So getting back to the novel, though it pains me. So the whole novel, I mean, just because your anecdote is interesting, is not because novel is incredible, as well as your anecdotes. So the whole novel takes place during the course of a curfew, as was mentioned when we first started talking about the novel, and the synopsis. And so again, though most of us understand what a curfew is, what a lockdown is, most of us have the luxury of not having lived through a time of curfew, right? And so what I specifically wanted to ask about is really the weight of time, during curfew, and especially when there's nothing digital to distract us. So, and so what I found very interesting your way of exploring the nature of time, the density of time in the course of a curfew. So could you talk a little bit about that? And I'm thinking now of the glaze and the, all. So if you could talk about what I really thought was time as the main character in this novel, and how you confronted that character.
Thank you for saying that. That's exactly how I thought about it, is this character of time, and it was something that particularly struck me when I was in Kashmir, right? From the times that I was there, when there would be a curfew. I wrote this book before the lockdown happened, and more people had some form of stay at home to understand the weight of time with. But you're right, what's different in these contexts where there's a conflict is that the first thing to go when there's a curfew is the internet. The next thing to go is a television. Then often the electricity goes away, right? And so all of these tools that I certainly used when I was under the COVID lockdown in New Mexico was distract myself on my devices most of the time. That doesn't exist really, right? And so then it became a question of saying, so what do you do? And so one of the parts of the book, which the protagonist calls a guide to curfew time pass, that's what he calls it, was for me my own way of trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who has to live that multiple times a year, multiple times a week, right? And to consider how would that person think about time? And so the way this character thinks about it is to break it down into these chunks, and he's developed these categories, these strategies, and he says, okay, so I'm going to spend 1 hour doing this thing called the glaze, and I'm not going to tell you all what that is. There's going to be another hour where I do something called the genie, and there's going to be another hour where I do this. And so he's broken down 24 hours into almost minute by minute segments so that he can decide how to pass the time. And that's how he sort of deals with this, right? And I think for her, the other protagonist, she doesn't know. And I think there's one part in the book where she looks at him and she says, I don't know if I can do this. Like, it's been a few hours into the curfew and I'm going out of my mind. And almost as if navigating time in that way is something you have to build a muscle for. Right? It's something like that you have to train for, like an athlete would, is how do you train yourself to pass the time in that way? So that was a really interesting aspect to explore, was just the heaviness of it.
Right. And what I really found fascinating was the cigarette smoking. I mean, I've never ever encountered smoking a cigarette broken down to that level of detail. It was extraordinary. And they were so deeply, profoundly savored, every single cigarette and every act of smoking and ashing and so on. And then, it was extraordinary, that just the breakdown of these simple, mundane acts to like almost ritualistic, sort of mythic levels. So that was really cool. And a really interesting way of thinking about time and the passage of time, which, is something we all have to confront at some point, but they have to do it from a very different place. That's very interesting. So now, as some of you might have guessed, none of the characters and none of the places in your novel are named, right? And naming, like language, is a rich, sort of fraught topic. And so, of course, not naming adds this very deeply allegorical quality to the work. But I'm wondering, were there other reasons that you chose not to name? And I mean, here I'm thinking of a line from the passage you just read to us, in which you write, quote, "They could allow the lack of naming to create the illusion of a relationship between equal peers," unquote. So aside from the allegorical qualities that not naming can provide, were there other reasons that you chose to not name?
Yeah, I mean, a very obvious reason for me, Shobha, is that, in my time as a community theater practitioner, everything that we made, because of this devised theater method, was based in quote unquote reality, right? And so this notion that you are presenting through theater some type of documentary of real people's lives, you know? So the sounds that you're hearing are my dog, who's clearly wanting to join the conversation, in case anyone's wondering what that growling is. And what I noticed was when there was that much specificity, when names were given, the conversation often steered toward what to me are the less interesting questions about war and why humans, we seem to have a proclivity for it. It would often go down to blame, right? So it would be, people would often ask, why are you blaming this side more than that side? Or why are you blaming him more than her? Or why are you blaming this region over that region? And I often found that the conversations were getting very unwieldy in that sense. And we weren't able to talk about the questions which I thought were really interesting, which were, what are these gray zones where it's really hard for us to tell who is victim and who is perpetrator? And how does one become an ally when one's a representative from, quote unquote, the occupier, right? It never got there because often we were just stuck in those details. And so that's why there's no places that have been named. I could have gone the route of creating completely fictionalized universes and created new names and different names that didn't have real world applications at all. And maybe someday I will. Right now, I don't think that's a skill I have. I think that's a whole nother area that many have worked on for a lifetime. So much of my work has been so centered on the real world that when I had to think about how do I talk about it in a way that's just a little removed, this seemed the way that I could do it at this moment in my life.
Mm-hmm. It reminded me of Waiting for Godot, doesn't that?
Yeah.
Definitely not, there's no names, and that reminded me of, and now that I've brought up Waiting for Godot, the layout of your novel is so interesting. It's so unconventional. I've never read a novel. No novel reading experience has been like this. So for instance, some of the pages are split screen between the two characters as they're in their heads, or speaking with a door between them, for instance, and some of the pages are grayed out in a interesting way. And it's just a really unconventional way of laying out a novel, but the effect it had is it made me more engaged and more of an active reader. So, I'm wondering how you came upon this sort of layout, and was it in any way related to your theater work and your playwriting work?
I think so. The short answer would be absolutely, right? And I remember even in graduate school, often getting into these conversations with my professors, being like, well, do I really have to write an academic paper? I mean, I'm a theater maker. Can I give you a 1 paragraph analysis and then just write it however I want to write it? And luckily they said yes most of the time. So that was great. And so I think that's always been a question for me, Shobha, is thinking about how does a story look on the page also as an aesthetic object, if you will? How does it look? And how it looks help tell part of the story? At this point, I should mention that the earlier drafts of this book, there was like a clear dividing line in between the entire book, like everything happened either on the left or on the right. And I have to give a shout out to my amazing agent who's in the audience today, Mary Krinky. And she was really, really an important part of that process. And I think nuance that layout in ways that I hadn't thought to in the first draft, right? So essentially what you will see when you experience the book is, for most of the time, these two characters stay on the same side of the page. They talk in dialogue on the left-hand side of the page. But whenever contentious issues, whenever the word occupation is mentioned, you'll start seeing text float. So there will start emerging distance between them where they start occupying different sides of the page, right? And that eventually became, I thought, a far more nuanced way to think about it. It's not that these two characters are always divided. It's not that when we go to these conflict zones, we're always on, it's not always a binary, right? What makes it complicated is sometimes you feel like you understand. And then when that rupture happens, it feels a lot more hurtful and a lot more powerful. And so that sort of shifting wave-like quality to how the book looks is something that is particularly dear to my heart, and was enriched so much by my agent.
Oh, and absolutely nuanced. I hadn't even realized the word or the concept of occupation was what was making it fluid, and really a courageous choice, because I would have never thought to sort of have a layout for a novel like in this, so that the layout itself is part of the sort of point of the novel, and is part of the thematics of the novel. So that's really cool. So okay, now this is again something that I was so delighted by myself for noticing, but one of the things that I noted, by the way, the layout is very obvious. One of the things I noted though about the relationships in the book and in the novel, and which again is an aspect that I love discovering, is the sexual fluidity of many of the characters. So for instance, the bride, who we never directly meet, we know that she has two dads. And the main characters themselves, they have had, partners or lovers of the same gender. So I'm wondering, how, I imagine this was not accidental. So what were you saying with the sexual fluidity and with the almost just, mundaneness of this, fluidity in lovers and relationships? Such a, interesting choice.
I think it goes back to that, the first question you asked, and this notion of how we occupy ourselves, right? And at one point, I found myself thinking about, okay, so what's her family like? What's his family like? Who have they dated in their past? Who are their lovers? And I realized that I was putting categories on it in some bizarre way. Like I was trying to define, oh, so the parents are this, or they are this, and I kept asking this question: why am I trying to categorize people when the whole premise of this novel is about these shifting senses of self and others, right? And so at that point, it sort of made that intentional decision to say, well, what if in this world everyone loves everyone, right? And so it's just like, it just happens to be who you happen to love in a specific moment. So that was the larger concept behind it. In a more practical level, I was also thinking about it as a very useful tool in plausible deniability. So if some country ever came to me and said, this is about us and you're calling us occupiers, I could say, but in your country, this doesn't happen, right? So look at all these people. They love everyone of all genders. This doesn't happen in any country, so it can't be real.
Brilliant. Oh my gosh.
So there was this like conceptual, idealistic notion, but also the very practical, okay, this is gonna help me get out of some sticky situations.
That is absolutely the most clever thing I've ever heard. Okay, so lastly, we're running short on time though, although we're happy to keep going as long as needed. But what I wanted to ask lastly about is why war zones? So much of your work, if not most of your work, all of your work centers around war zones. And what I like to ask is, what is it that draws you to the complexity, the sort of the bewilderment and the chaos of war zones? What is it about them that draws you to explore them? Yeah.
I've thought about this. I still think about this because in some ways there is this element of being this quote unquote dark tourist, right? So you're this bizarre voyeur who's never experienced war themselves, who's going into these places to see this stuff. And what I've come to think about, the answer that feels more true than not on more days than not, is that it draws from some level of feeling guilty at how much dumb luck I've had in my life. So I grew up in Coimbatore with a wonderful family. We never had to worry about anything. I had a very, very privileged, safe life. And even my immigration experience to this country, compared to many others, has really been quite easy, right? And so I've always considered myself to be such a privileged person. And there was this nature of this guilt that came from that said, why? Right? I had nothing to do with it. I just got lucky and happened to be born into this family in this space. And so that's sort of where I think it stems from, is to say, if I got all of this without any work on my part, then perhaps, and I know this sounds really sanctimonious, so I apologize for the for that quality of it, but it does feel like a moral obligation, right? That as someone who was born with more, that you have a duty to give back in some way. Whether this is the right way, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder, maybe I should have been a doctor and joined Doctors Without Borders. Maybe that would have been a more tangible way, but that's another discussion, right? So what is the right way? What is the most effective way? What is effective, right? But I think that's the answer that has seemed to be most true for me so far.
Yeah, and I love this idea of having, being in dialogue with yourself and with the world around your privilege and your sort of duty around that privilege and the lack of privilege that we see all around us. And that's an ongoing dialogue we must have. It's imperative that each of us have that with ourselves and with the world. So thank you. And on that note, Peter, I don't know how to access audience questions. Nandita or Peter, if you could.
Yeah,
Yes.
so it seems like they're finally coming through. So we have, see, a comment from Nancy. I know the novel is not about Kashmir, but the occupation there involves three nations, India, Pakistan, and China. Therefore, the occupier and the occupied situation is very complex. Could you discuss this, please?
Yeah, Nancy, it is complex. There are various points of focus depending on who you speak with in Kashmir about who the occupier is and who the occupied is. I will say that it's not something that I want to get into in this conversation, just because it is an extremely explosive debate, and I don't think that I could be as nuanced as necessary here. There are various forces at play. It's really, really complicated, and I'm going to leave it at that.
And we have a question from Larry Bensky. Are you going to make reference to Russia's attempted current occupation of Ukraine or Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories? Are you lending your personal support in these cases? Why or why not?
Interesting question. Many people have actually, many early readers of the book have been drawing the parallel between Russia and Ukraine, certainly with Israel and Palestine as well. And yes, that is the whole point of situating this novel as an allegory, is for it to be applicable to as many situations as possible. In terms of my own lending a hand, Larry, I think this goes back to the spine of this place, that place, which is this notion of insider-outsider dynamic. So when I started my work, I started in East Africa, in northern Uganda, in Rwanda. And one of the reasons I left the work there was realizing that I was too much of an outsider to be able to engage in any meaningful or ethical way, especially in a very obvious way, not speaking the language, right? So in that case, not speaking Kinyarwanda was a huge hurdle in even being able to get to know more people, or people of different socioeconomic classes. So one of the reasons that I've decided to focus more of my attention on conflicts within the South Asian subcontinent is because somewhere straddling that insider-outsider hyphen seems to be the place where I can engage in a way that makes most sense for me ethically and politically. So to compare the language issue, right? So in Rwanda, we would often have to speak in English when I was conducting these theater workshops, which for many of these folks was their third language, and for me is my first language. And that immediately creates a hierarchy in terms of how that space functions and how they're able to communicate their stories. what functioned in a really interesting way in Kashmir is that we were all speaking our second language, right? So we were speaking a version of a mix of Hindi and Urdu that we would call Hindustani. And mine was, yeah, second-ish language, yeah, sort of broken, but it was not my colleague's first language either. And so there was this immediate sense of, okay, we're all trying to communicate in this language that none of us speaks really well. And so let's take it from there. And that immediately allowed the power differential to look different. And so to go back to why or why not being more involved with Israel, Palestine, and Russia, Ukraine, for me, it's partly, I don't know if I'm able to situate myself in that context in the same way yet.
Vishnu asks, how long did it take you to write the novel?
Great question. Because which time would be the answer? The first draft took me a couple of months, no, was it 3 to 6 months, something like that? I can't remember. It was the first draft. So that was the official physical writing phase. And then there was the part that involved finding an agent, which took another 6 months. And then we worked on the script together for a few months. And then there was the part of finding the editor and the publisher, which took another 6 months, which then became, also incorporating their edits and doing a little bit of rewriting in that stage of the process. So from conception to today, it's been almost 3 years, right? How much of that is actual sitting down and writing? It depends.
Yeah. And then Jennifer asks, what is your next project?
The next project that Mary and I are working on is a piece called Lights Up July, which is, the subtitle is a novel, a memoir, a play. So that gives you a sense of what it's trying to do. So it's basically trying to play with the genre of memoir, but then realizing that memory is so fragmented and that memory can make up all of these facets about who we are and how we are. It just sort of drills down into that more and tries to push that, how much of this actually happened and how much of this is actually a novel that I'm creating in my head about what my life has been like. But similar quest as This Place, That Place, and that the pages are not, they don't always look the same, not what you'd expect, right? And that's where the drama part of it comes in.
Well, our time is coming to a close. Shobha, did you have any more questions or comments before we wrap?
No, just that it was one of the most enjoyable reads I've had in a long time, Nandita, so thank you for it. And honestly, it really was mind-blowing in terms of what a novel can do. And I think this is like an eternal question that, writers ask themselves and reviewers and so on, literary critics, but it really just was, a tectonic shift for me in terms of what a novel is capable of and the kind of conversations we can and should be having. So thank you.
Thank you, Shobha. Those questions were delightful. Thank you for being such an engaged and generous reader. And Peter, thank you so much for hosting City Lights. When I got this invitation, I jumped up and down for a little bit. And so it's an honor to be having this lunch with you.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for a fantastic evening. I mean, this has been such an engaging conversation. I mean, so many great insights and anecdotes, and I mean, really a pleasure. And I'm hoping we get to do this in person someday in store. So thank you, Nandita Dinesh. Congratulations for a just stellar literary debut. And we look forward to your future work. Thank you, Shobha, for doing the honors. You are such an excellent interviewer, ever grateful. A huge shout out to Sammy Sontag over at Melville House. Also to Dennis Johnson for all that he does, publishing awesome work, truly great indie press in the truest spirit of indies. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and helping complete the circle. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, a publishing program, and educational outreach. all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So be safe, be well, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Long live City Lights.